D. Vacordigalair, my name is James Nagle, welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. On this episode I'm going to take a look at Maud Gonne's autobiography A Servant of the Queen, and how it relates to her belief in the occult. Maud Gonne is most often referenced in relation to the famous men in her life. She was the muse and unrequited love of poet W.B. Yeats, she was the wife of executed 1916 Rising Combatant John McBride, she was the mother of politician, IRA Chief of Staff and Nobel and Lenin Peace Prize winner Sean McBride, and earlier, the mistress of French politician Lucien Millevoye. But Maud was a fascinating person in and of her own right. She was born in 1866 in England into a wealthy Anglo-Irish ascendancy family, and following the death of her mother, her family moved to Ireland where she witnessed firsthand the poverty and hardship that the Irish lived under. A career as an actress was cut short by illness, and while recovering in France, she met and began an affair with Lucien Millevoye, who was a follower of General Boulanger, the figurehead of France's desire for revenge against Germany following their defeat in 1871. Maud writes that she undertook secret missions on behalf of the Boulanges party to Russia to arrange an alliance with them before Germany could do so. In the decades ahead, she travelled throughout Ireland, Europe and the United States, agitating for Irish nationalism. She visited IRB prisoners in England, helped to defend tenants from eviction during the latter stages of the Land War, famously played the title role in W.B. Yeats's Kathleen Ní Shúilleabháin, organised a massive picnic for children in Dublin to counter the one held there by Queen Victoria, and in 1900 she founded Inini na hÉireann, the predecessor to Cumann na mBan. She was also a founding member of Sinn Féin, and this all occurred before her marriage to the Boer War veteran John McBride in 1903, which brings her autobiography to an end, though she continued to play a role in Irish nationalist politics for decades to come. Most of her major achievements and contributions to Irish nationalism had occurred by this stage. Though her biography was written in 1938, so she knew what followed, there is a hopeful tone for a happy future ahead in the final chapter as she and John McBride ignore the advice and pleas of friends not to marry. 2 years later, the marriage broke down amid allegations of domestic abuse and infidelity by McBride. Maud instigated divorce proceedings in Paris, but one was never given, and after McBride's death in 1916, she wore black mourning garb for the rest of her life. Another reason her biography ends early is the death of the book's central character, Queen Victoria. On the throne since 1837, Victoria acts as an unseen antagonist, opposing Maud Gonne through her most active years. The book's title can be read as a parody of the service that Maud renders as a citizen of the Empire and a subject of Her Majesty. But the Queen mentioned in the title is actually Kathleen Ní Shúilleabháin, a personification of Ireland and the role Maud would later play on stage. In the opening chapter, while returning from Mayo by train, she looked out of the window, and there she writes, "I saw a tall, beautiful woman with dark hair blown on the wind, and I knew it was Kathleen Ní Shúilleabháin. She was crossing the bog towards the hills, springing from stone to stone over the treacherous surface. I heard a voice say, 'You are one of the little stones on which the feet of the Queen have rested on her way to freedom.'" Now, you could argue that this is an allegory or a symbol or a literary device, and maybe it is. But throughout her writings, Maud expresses a belief in what would be termed the occult. In the late 1800s, many of those in the Celtic Revival and the Anglo-Irish elite, most notably W.B. Yeats, Bram Stoker and George Russell, became members of esoteric organisations in the pursuit of hidden knowledge. Secretive organisations like the Freemasons had existed for centuries, while some were more recent creations, such as the Theosophical Society of Madame Blavatsky. In a chapter entitled Occult Experiences, Maud writes that she joined the society while I was experimenting with the occult, always in the hopes of gaining power to use for the great objective of my life. Yeats had introduced her to this organisation, and she writes that later he was lured from the Theosophists to the Golden Dawn, where more practical magic might be learned, though there are some reports that he was ejected from the organisation due to his magical experiments. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn promised access to the practical magic that Yeats desired, and was made up of a series of ranks which adepts of the order moved through, at higher levels unveiling more powerful secrets and rituals. As an adeptus minor of the order, Yeats created the arcane tools needed for his rank, such as a wand and an elemental dagger. He maintained a notebook detailing what he had learned, and later he experimented with automatic writing, where his hand and pen became a tool through which the spirit world could communicate. Yeats' involvement with the occult is fascinating, in particular his battles with Aleister Crowley. Crowley attacked Yeats from the astral plane in a fight over a vault in the Golden Dawn's possession, and Yeats rallied a number of white magicians of the order to defend the main temple in London. But Maud Gonne had little interest in this structured form of occultism. She was suspicious of the passwords and rites taught at each rank, and after confirming that they were copied from Freemasonry, she left the Golden Dawn. In the book, she blames Freemasonry for the Entente Cordiale, the alliance between Britain and France that she says was the direct cause of the First World War. She told Yeats that they had been duped, but he continued to believe that these words had power, and he remained dedicated to the order for 30 years through a number of leadership battles in this dimension and others. In her autobiography, Maud recounts a number of paranormal experiences. In Paris, after consuming some hashish, a shadow appears at the foot of her bed and tells her that she can leave her body. Her spirit flies through the night sky and observes the city, and the following morning she dedicates herself to practicing this power without the need for drugs, the hash having made her feel sick. Later, to prove her powers to a doubting Italian war veteran, Amilcare Cipriani, she promises that even though she doesn't know where in the city he lives, she will visit him that night. The following morning, to his astonishment, she is able to recount what he was doing and what he was wearing the previous evening. She remembers a beautiful dark woman with the sorrowful eyes who watched her in her cot as a child. Yeats and MacGregor Mahers, a high-ranking adept of the Golden Dawn, surmise that this is a spirit similar to an Egyptian Ka, part of Maud's personality that survived death in a previous incarnation. Maud begins to practice controlling this spirit. I called her up and sent her to people I wanted to persuade. How far this was fact and how far imagination, I do not know, but certainly I was able to influence people's minds and get them to do things in an extraordinary way. During a séance to contact the spirit, Maher's wife is able to communicate with it, and tells Maud that the spirit confessed to killing a child and was remorseful for it. Maud, however, grew afraid of the spirit and never contacted her again. At times, what Maud describes is more akin to superstition, or what we would call pishogues. She seems to believe strongly in a curse imposed upon the family by a Catholic priest. An Anglican ancestor had acquired land that belonged to the church, and a priest cursed the family that no daughter of the Gonnes would be happy in marriage. She believes in the Banshee, but instead of a screaming portent of doom, views her as a personification of Ireland, and during her land war days in Donegal is proud to be known as the Woman of the Shielda, as though the people of these areas can sense her connection to the spirit world. The occult, the paranormal, and the superstitions of old Ireland are mentioned in every chapter of the book. In one, the spirits help her to win money in a casino for the benefit of Fenian prisoners. But there is one specific chapter that I want to focus on. It is the third last chapter of the book, and it's entitled The Battle of the Rotunda. In 1901, after the death of his mother, the new King Edward began to tour his domains, and near the top of his list was the second city of the empire, Dublin. At the time, Timothy Harrington was the Lord Mayor. As an avowed nationalist, there wasn't a hope that he would offer an official welcome to the monarch. But Arthur Griffith had discovered a conspiracy. Harrington had considerable financial debts, and a group of unionist politicians were going to offer him an incentive to be absent from Dublin during the King's visit. His substitute, Alderman Cotton, would then take over his duties and present His Majesty with the keys to the city. When Maud found out about this, she mobilised Griffith, Edward Martin, and a few others, styling themselves as the Citizens' Watch Committee, and headed to a meeting of the Irish Parliamentary Party which Harrington was chairing at the Rotunda. A large crowd had gathered, and John Redmond, the leader of the newly reformed party, was slated to talk first on party finances. Members of Anini Nahéireann had also taken up positions in the crowd to cause a disturbance if needed. The plan was that before the meeting could start, Martin would put a question to Harrington about whether or not he would be absent from Dublin during the King's visit, but as he rose to do this, his nerves failed him. Harrington realised what was happening and called for questions to be held until the end of the meeting, but Maud knew that he would drag proceedings out so that there would be no time left over. As Redmond rose to start the meeting, so too did Maud Gonne, shouting over him. The crowd started to turn violent. Some were angry that she was disrupting proceedings and disrespecting Redmond, while others were outraged at the idea that the British king might be afforded a royal welcome in Dublin. Someone attempted to pull a chair from the platform, and then all hell broke loose. Maud was grabbed and pulled towards the exit. When she tried to face her attacker, she found it to be one of her supporters, worried about her safety, and only then did she realise a fight had broken out and almost every chair in the building had been broken. Redmond attempted to calm the crowd so that he could discuss income and expenditure, but the meeting broke up in disarray. The matter had been brought out into the open, and pressure could no longer be used to get Harrington out of Dublin. The king did not receive a royal welcome. So what has this chapter got to do with the occult, or Maud's belief in the paranormal? Even though the chapter is entitled The Battle of the Rotunda, the events of that battle take up only a few pages, and indeed she deals with it so briefly she goes back over it again in greater detail at the start of her Bureau of Military History statement in 1949. Closing out this chapter, though, is the following paragraph. Luck and the will of the gods had not deserted me in public affairs, though I had begun to doubt them, and as for my private affairs, why should the gods look after them? I had long ago chosen to devote my life to the one objective of freeing Ireland, and since then I had invariably found that anything I undertook for myself never personally succeeded, and so had given up trying. So long as I worked for Ireland, I felt safe and protected. So protected that I never raised a finger or spoke a word against any enemies I made who tried to injure me. I was sometimes almost frightened to see how misfortune always fell on them. Queer misfortunes, loss of health, or money, or children. In her life, Maud sees a greater power at play. When things go her way, she attributes it to aid from and approval of the spirit world. Personal disaster is attributed to otherworldly forces trying to keep her on track and dedicated to what is important, working for Ireland. But it is the final two sentences that are the most striking. In the misfortunes of those that oppose her, she again sees the hand of a greater power, and if she left it there we mightn't think twice about it, but in her description of the queer misfortunes her enemies suffer, she must have had somebody in mind. At some point in time, she attributed a child's death to the spirits that looked over her, a tragedy that the child's parents brought upon themselves by standing against her. Possibly there is a clue to who she had in mind earlier in the same chapter. The chapter opens with Maud arriving at her younger sister Kathleen's house in preparation for a family wedding. "Why didn't you bring Iseult for the wedding?" her nephew Toby asks. Maud explains that after the wedding she has a number of political meetings to attend, and that while she was in America, Iseult stayed at a convent in France. Maud has just been to see her there and bought her a tiny alligator. Maud tells the children that Iseult is very happy at the convent. All the nuns love her. Sister Maria and Sister Beatrice play great games with her. There is a big garden with big trees and a pond with fishes in it, and Iseult and Sister Beatrice are going to tie a ribbon around the alligator's neck and let him swim in it. There are altars and statues and grottos everywhere in the gardens. Iseult is mentioned only 3 times in Maud's autobiography. The first time, Maud arrives unexpectedly in Paris and says that her maid, Madame de Bourbon, was taking care of a charming child I had adopted called Iseult. Maud had came to live in Paris in the late 1880s and maintained a residence there until 1917. She first moved to be closer to Millevoye when they began their affair. He was 16 years older than her and married at the time, and she moved again when she gave birth to their son George in 1890. The following year, though, he died, and Maud was inconsolable. She was just 25, and after interring her child in a crypt, she travelled back to Ireland. On the mail boat into Dublin, her fellow passengers thought she was grieving for Charles Stewart Parnell, who had died recently and whose body was being transported aboard the same ship. It was then that W.B. Yeats introduced her to the occult circles that he travelled in. Spiritualism and mysticism was very much in vogue at the time, especially Eastern mysticism. She describes how interested she was in George Russell and his study of Hinduism, and how her friend Ella Young formed a group after long meditations on the swastika, long before anyone had heard of fascism. Later, a French priest asked her why she was still a member of the Anglican Church, which was headed by Queen Victoria, why she didn't convert to Roman Catholicism. Maud said that she didn't think her belief in reincarnation fitted with the teachings of the Church, though she does convert before her marriage to John McBride. Reincarnation appears frequently throughout A Servant of the Queen. In Paris, she is friends with a man who believes that in a previous life they were mother and son, and she tells Millevoye that she is certain they met in a past life. But years later, in his memoirs, Yeats wrote that Maud was obsessed with reincarnation and constantly inquired about whether it was possible, and that George Russell told her it was. He explained to her the process of metempsychosis. If she and George's father, Millevoye, were to conceive a child besides George's coffin, his soul would transmigrate to the new body and be born again. Maud and Millevoye had broken up after their son's death, but she contacted him with a proposal, and in late 1893, possibly on Halloween night, when the barrier to the spirit world was weakest, they met at the graveyard that George had been interned at. They climbed down into his crypt, the largest in the whole graveyard, and had sex beside his coffin. Sure enough, Maud became pregnant, and in August of 1894 she gave birth to a daughter, who she named Iseult. Iseult grew up believing that she was adopted or that Maud was her sister or cousin. She spent most of her childhood in France and was educated at the convent where Maud often left her. The only other reference to her in the biography is in the final chapter. When told that Maud is going to marry John MacBride, she says, "I hate John MacBride." In 1905, Yeats declares that MacBride molested Iseult, and this is one of the contributing factors to the collapse in the marriage, though there is speculation that Yeats was motivated by his own jealousy. He had proposed to Maud numerous times and would do so again after MacBride's execution. Maud never accepted Iseult as her daughter. When she died in 1953, her will mentioned only her son Sean, and a request that she be buried with a pair of George's shoes, 62 years after his death. Iseult died less than a year later, in 1954. A few days after arriving at her sister's house, Maud describes a visit to W.B. Yeats and how excited he was to show her a new leather armchair he had received as a gift from Lady Augusta Gregory. Lady Gregory was a member of a wealthy Anglo-Irish family and had married into even more Anglo-Irish wealth. Her husband, who was 35 years her senior, had passed away in 1892, and after this she set about turning their home at Coole Park in Galway into a focal point of the Celtic revival, where many of the great writers and poets and artists of the day gathered. Today she is considered to be one of the most important cultural figures of the time. She produced important collections of Irish myths, founded the Abbey Theatre, and wrote a number of plays, which, though they haven't aged well, were massively successful and had a large impact on Irish cultural nationalism. Maud Gonne, however, paints a different picture, and it becomes quickly apparent that she severely dislikes Lady Gregory. She describes her as a queer little old lady, rather like Queen Victoria, which is definitely not a compliment when coming from Maud Gonne. Of her friendship with Yeats and the new armchair she gave him, Maud writes, "I was glad he had a good friend, but feared she would take him away from the fight for Irish freedom." Maud describes how artists committed to the cause would return from Coole Park despondent at their lack of money. She says that she and Gregory were on opposite sides of a conflict in the Abbey Theatre over art for art's sake or art for propaganda. Maud believed that art could be used to serve a political purpose of furthering the cause of Irish freedom, and much of the art produced during the late 1800s and early 1900s is highly political. But she accuses Lady Gregory of resenting the intrusion of politics and of taking many of the great political artists away from the cause by turning their heads with money. She is more interested in prestige and reputation. She has a great deal of wealth and is able to use it to buy a position of importance for herself through patronage of those more talented than her. Some of Maud's criticisms of Lady Gregory might be accurate, but there is a definite hint of jealousy and even fear. A few pages earlier, in rejecting another proposal from Yeats, she tells him that he should be glad she will not marry him. The unhappiness this causes him helps him to write his best work. Maud says that because of his friendship with Lady Gregory, his national outlook underwent a complete change. But Lady Gregory is now providing a platform for his work and is co-authoring some of his plays with him. Is there a fear that she, and not Maud, will be seen as the great driving force behind his talent? Yeats wrote his most overtly political works after he met Lady Gregory, not least Kathleen Ni Houlihan, which he co-wrote with her. In this play, Ireland appears in the form of an old woman and encourages men to die for her so that she might take back her 4 green fields and remove the strangers from her house. In 1938, Yeats wrote Man and the Echo, in which he asks, "Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot, which was a reference to the 1916 Rising. Because of this play and poems like September 1913 and Easter 1916, he was regarded as having contributed to the foundation of the state when he took his seat in the Senate in 1923. But this was a state that Maud Gonne opposed, having supported the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. Lady Gregory would secure from the Free State an annual subsidy for the Abbey Theatre, and many more of Maud's artistic friends found places for themselves within the new administration. Following this brief description of Lady Gregory, Maud returns to her cousin's wedding and discusses the family curse with her sister Kathleen. Her own marriage was an unhappy one, and their cousin May would be divorced in less than 12 months, proving to Maud that the curse was still in place, and after this she launches into a description of the Battle of the Rotunda. When Maud came to write her autobiography, when she came to write of the misfortunes that had befallen her enemies, many of those she was writing about were dead. The only principal character still alive, for little more than a year after the book's publication, was W.B. Yeats. Lady Gregory had died in 1932. Though she died at Coole Park, the house and land around it had been sold to the Irish state in 1927 and divided amongst former tenants. The vault containing her husband's body now sat in the middle of a farmer's field, and so she couldn't be laid to rest beside him. The entire contents of the house were sold off, and in the years ahead the house fell into ruin and no longer stands. Lady Gregory had one child, Robert. In 1915 he joined the RAF to fight in the First World War, even though he was married and had children of his own. In January of 1918, possibly in a case of friendly fire, his plane was shot down over northern Italy. At Lady Gregory's request, Yeats would dedicate a number of poems to him, most notably An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. To be immortalised by Yeats is a fate he shares with Maud's son George. In the margins of a collection of poems by Lady Gregory, Yeats wrote On a Child's Death, but never published it during his life. Is Lady Gregory one of the enemies Maud talks about, who are visited by misfortunes? Is the death of her son evidence to Maud of the powers of the spirits that, for better or worse, watch over her? When I read this chapter, that's the impression that I got. When explaining to her nephew why Iseult was left in France, it seems like she's trying to assure herself that Iseult is happy. She could have easily gotten through the book without making mention of this episode, yet she puts it in here for a specific purpose. There seems to be a thread running from the description of Iseult to that of Lady Gregory to that of the misfortunes handed out by the gods. More than any other chapter, there is intent behind every word written here, not to inform, but to justify her actions as a mother, and to justify her actions as a revolutionary. Throughout the book, Maud seeks to portray herself as dedicated to nothing but Ireland. She breaks her health for its benefit, talks of nothing else to those she comes in contact with, and even turns to the occult to see if there she can find some secrets to aid in the quest for freedom. Money she gives away gladly to defend Fenians in the docks. But how far this was fact and how far imagination, I do not know. The Lady Gregory she presents is one for her to be contrasted with. She drives Yeats' imagination, while Gregory extinguishes it. She spends money for the cause of Ireland, while Gregory spends money against it. Maud can appear at times to be cold-hearted, uncaring, and unfair to those around her, expecting the same unceasing devotion from them as she herself gives, and meeting only with constant disappointment. This is how she sees and presents herself. But we can see also the troubled life that she sometimes lived. She lost her mother at a young age and was dropped into an Ireland where her accent, her religion, and her wealth marked her as an outsider. She was barred from organisations like the Irish Parliamentary Party and the Irish Republican Brotherhood because she was a woman, and took little part in the cultural revival because she was not an artist. Though she goes on to have a major impact on all of these groups and organisations, it is always from the outside where she will remain after the establishment of both the Free State and then Fianna Fáil, denouncing De Valera for entering into constitutional politics. She suffered the loss of a child and the collapse of a marriage, and for years suffered constant arrests and raids, first by the British and then by those she once counted as allies. As Kathleen Ní Húlaháin leaves the Gillane house to continue looking for men to die in her cause, she tells Michael, a young man captivated by her words, "It is a hard service they take that help me. They that have red cheeks will have pale cheeks for my sake, and for all that they will think they were well paid. Though Maud's practice of the occult never results in power that will aid her to free Ireland, she constantly invokes the spirits to protect her and to give her courage in times when those around her have deserted her. She sometimes feels that the gods too have deserted her, but her great victory at the Battle of the Rotonda proves otherwise. The misfortunes visited upon her enemies show that even when they were lifted high and she knocked low, she has always been true to Ireland. She has always remained a servant of the Queen. Maud led a fascinating life, and it's difficult for a single episode to do justice to her struggles and achievements. It's almost impossible to talk about her without veering off into discussions on Yeats, and her position as an outsider meant that her reputation waned after the Civil War. Her life and relationships with others were profoundly complicated and don't fit into any easy narrative. It's the paragraph from the end of the Battle of the Rotunda that inspired me to do this Pages Out of Irish History series, the idea that there were amazing stories buried in a single event or in a single statement. I was struck by the hidden meaning behind the words when I read them first. They seemed to be pointed and purposeful and even cruel, and maybe they are. But it was only at this point that I began to look past the invincible veneer that Maud had built up around her in the rest of the book, and saw a woman who had given and lost almost everything in her life and was seeking some meaning and purpose to it all. She is definitely someone that I intend to research further in the future. Make sure to check out the description for links to our Twitter and Facebook accounts to keep up to date with new episodes and interesting articles on the events of 100 years ago. Accordia, thank you for joining me on The Irish Nation Lives. Slán go fóill.